Hello and welcome to The Menu, Monocle Radio's food and drink programme. I'm your host, Chiara Rimella. Coming up, we have an episode toasting to the art of winemaking. First up, we speak to writer, restaurateur and wine lover Dan Keeling about his brand new book.
Wine is about pleasure, food is about pleasure, music is about pleasure, and they're all the things that I've kind of been working in and, I've been very privileged to do so, but I have a bit of a sense of humour and lighten up.
Also in the programme, we head to a vineyard in Washington State.
We're not locked or pigeonholed into a certain style or a certain set of grapes. Our climate allows us to do a whole variety of things, and so you'll have Cabernet and Riesling in the same vineyard.
Plus, our in-house wine expert crowns her wine of the month. All that here in The Menu on Monocle Radio. People are passionate about wine in a way unlike any other drink. And it's not just because of its millennia-long tradition or the fact that it is quite obviously delicious. The hard graft and elaborate process behind making each bottle are what fascinates drinkers and makes them attached to the stories as well as the taste. Other than running a successful wine import business and 3 esteemed restaurants around London, back in 2013, Dan Keeling started Noble Rot magazine, a publication that's an ode to wine, the people who make it and those who enjoy it. Though its writing is profoundly knowledgeable, the magazine is also a riot to read, taking a witty, tongue-in-cheek approach to articles that are respectful of the craft and the industry, but don't take themselves too seriously. Now, Keeling has compiled some of the best pieces from the magazine into Who's Afraid of Romanée Conti, a book that's meant to be a useful guide for those looking to expand their cellars, but also a way to entice new people into discovering vignerons and labels without feeling intimidated by what can sometimes be perceived as a bit of a closed circle. I started by asking him how he has developed the craft of writing about wine.
Frank Zappa said something along the lines of writing about music is like dancing about architecture, and in the first issue, I think, of Noble Rot magazine, I think I kind of referenced that and said it's the same thing with wine. So it is quite hard. It's very hard. I mean, putting flavours into words, putting music into words is incredibly hard. So a lot of the writing is about telling the stories of the people, the places, the traditions that need to be passed on of these beautiful kind of places. But also the feeling of wine, how does it make you feel? We all have read tasting notes, which kind of can have all the kind of subjective fruit and mineral words and descriptors, but that's quite subjective, and I don't really take that much notice of those kind of notes, but I kind of want to be told how it might make me feel, if that makes sense. Also, it's hard not to fall into cliches of wine and food writing or music or any kind of writing. And there's a great book by Martin Amis called The War Against Cliché. And I really, if it wasn't called Who's Afraid of Romanée Conti, I'd love to have called this book The War Against Wine Cliché. These wine cliches are often, from long ago in the past, like things like life's too short to drink bad wine and the first duty of a wine is to be red. And I really hate those cliches because I don't think it is the first duty of a wine. I love white wine, I love orange wine, I love sherries, I love all sorts. But also the one I hate the most is demystifying wine. Like, wine doesn't need demystifying. Wine is a mystery, and actually that's kind of part of its appeal to me, is that it's not this, the wines that I write about in the book, certainly, they're not these wines that have been completely kind of stripped of all flavour just in the name of consistency and commercialism. They're living wines made by people that are small families a lot of the time that haven't been aggressively processed, and they're capable of reaching these incredible highs, and sometimes they can have off days as well, but it's that kind of mirroring of life that I love. So, yeah, I mean, there are cliches in my book, obviously, even...
Not that many.
I mean, as a writer, you're constantly on the lookout, but they can creep in, and it's just being on guard. But, yeah, the war against wine cliche.
Well, I'm interested in delving more into this idea of demystifying and whether it's appropriate or not, because the book is also really funny. I found myself laughing out loud at some of the stuff, and yet there is obviously a seriousness to what you do. So I guess I want to ask you, how serious do you think you are about wine in the wider meaning of the word serious?
Yeah, I mean, there was this thing that we used to say about the magazine back in the day, which was, light-hearted but not lightweight in terms of the approach. There's a place for academic writing. And of course, when you study wine, I've studied WSET courses and the diploma and things like that. And my business partner's a master of wine. And there's definitely a place for academic writing. But I like writing that's full of humour and character and generally. So with all of the writing that I do, I want it to have a sense of humour. It needs a bit of balance. Life is not just something just to be completely like morose and serious about all the time. Wine is about pleasure. Food is about pleasure. Music is about pleasure. And they're all the things that I've kind of been working in. And, I've been very privileged to do so. But I have a bit of a sense of humour and lighten up.
Well, I have to admit that I like wine and I like drinking it, but I didn't know who Romanée Conti was. So please, can you tell us who Romanée Conti is? Because the titular essay or the titular piece of the book is a phenomenal piece of writing. Who is Romanée Conti and why should we be perhaps afraid of him?
Yeah, Romanée Conti is a vineyard. So it's a plot of land in Burgundy and it's owned by the Domaine de la Romanée Conti. It's a historic vineyard. It goes back hundreds of years to medieval times. It was sold to the Prince de Conti in, I think, 1760. It is known as, it's the most fabled wine in the world that comes from this small little plot of land. I mean, I could have called the book Who's Afraid of Fine Wine, but Who's Afraid of Romanée Conti had a much better ring to it. And it is known as the kind of the high point of wine. I tasted it before I came up with the title, but that very small thimble amounts when you get to visit the Domain. And they also do a tasting in London every February with Corney and Barrow, their importers. But to actually drink it, that's how you get to understand the wine. And I came up with this title and I was thinking about the kind of serendipity of it the other day. But there's a book that somebody gave me years ago. I didn't really read it, but it's called The Secret. It's a very famous self-help book. And I think the premise of it is if you kind of put positive thought out there, stuff's going to happen in your life. So when I came up with the title, like a few months later, I got invited to this really crazy tasting at the Domaine de la Romanée Conti for 25 vintages of the of the wine. And yeah, it was amazing to be able to experience what is known as the high point of wine and then try and contextualise all the other wines from Chianti to, Bordeaux to, Brunello de Montalcino's and all sorts of other wines. Where do they fit in this kind of structure or hierarchy of wine? How much better is it and is it better? All these kind of questions. So it is a beautiful wine. It's a very subtle wine. It's a very rare wine. Probably 5,000 bottles are made a year. Yeah, it was nerve-wracking to taste because I didn't know if I was ever going to get to really drink it in the kind of quantities that were available on the day.
There's also so many people in this book. There's a lot of pictures of soil and land, but there's so many portraits of people who look like they're having a great time.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about how you approach meeting these people and the incredible cast of characters that you've met through the years doing the magazine and doing the business? And I suppose if there is something that links them all together, most of them seem pretty happy in the pictures.
Yeah, I think so. The first picture in the book is a guy called Jean-Marc Rouleau, and he makes wine in Meursault in Burgundy. He's a real superstar winemaker, and he was the first person that we really started working with our import company. He's a brilliant guy. He's also an actor. He introduced us to other people in Burgundy, and in a similar way to in music, when I used to work in music, I did A&R for Parlophone Records and Ireland as well. It's really about making connections with different people and like-minded people. So from one person leads you to another and you get introduced to someone else, and I think our magazine has opened doors for us as well. So my A&R kind of training kind of kicked in, and it's like, who are the hottest new winemakers? There's a new generation of winemakers coming through in Burgundy and Chianti and Barolo and all these places, and they're all, well, they're probably even younger than me now. There's a lot of people coming through in their 30s taking over their domains. So these people, because today how the world is connected, they're not so much like their parents or their grandparents where they would just be just kind of local focused. They're into art, they're into music, they're into movies, they're into all these things that we talk about in the magazine too. So yeah, it's meeting like-minded people. As the magazine has really helped with that. And with our import company putting together our collective of winemakers has felt like working at a record label and signing artists to it. So I often, when I start talking about our winemakers, I start calling them artists by accident. It just feels like there's such a blurring of the two worlds.
It does seem to me like you tend to go back to the regions of your heart, you know, the Burgundy, the Bordeaux. We spend a lot of time in Spain, in France, in Italy in the book. And even though there are also other locations mentioned, these is kind of like the fulcrum of where you're spending a lot of time in the book. Why is that? And do you think that, I suppose, there is value in digging deeper and deeper and deeper in these and returning to these places? Yeah,
I think... Number one, in London, we're really connected to these places. It doesn't take long to get to Burgundy. You know, you go to King's Cross, then you're Paris, and then you're Dijon, pick up a hire car, you're in Burgundy by 4 o'clock. That's quick. You know, same with Spain, same with Italy, you know, and they're such brilliant places to visit. You know, who doesn't want to go to Barolo and eat truffles in November and drink Barolo? Or who doesn't want to go to Sherry and go to like some ancient bodega and then go and, you know, have octopus grotesque, which was the local dish that we had in San Luca de Barrameda. So there's a big draw to go back there. And, you know, I love South African wine, I love Californian wine, I love Australian wine, but rarely do we get to go there. I mean, we went to Australia earlier this year to the Melbourne Food Festival, which was great. It's just, they're further away, they cost more money to go there. You know, the Californian wine I really like, but it's the same price as French wine, and French wine was kind of our first love at Noble Rot and always will be. So with our businesses and, you know, having a family, having a life, you can only really devote so much time to travelling. And, Burgundy's got a big pullback. You know, I really want to go to Tuscany, which I haven't been to for a while, but I love Chianti, and I think that's a really undervalued wine and region. So, getting to South Africa, for example, looked at going this year as well, but, you know, the flights are now a lot more than they once were, and it's just harder. So to write about something, I really feel that you have to go there and speak to the people, eat the food and spend some time, because else you're just kind of, you might be falling back on all these old cliches about Californian wine or South African wine. It's just trying to cut through that and just be there.
That was Dan Keeling speaking to me in the studio at Midori House. This is The Menu. Most of those who drink wine from the US will probably be familiar with bottles from California. Further up the coast, Washington State may not be quite as well known globally as a wine region, but it is in fact the country's second largest producer. Here, geography and climate combine to create an amenable setting for growing grapes at a latitude that's roughly equivalent to that between Bordeaux and Burgundy for equally tasty and robust results. Monocle's Seattle correspondent Gregory Scruggs travelled to the state's winemaking hub of Walla Walla during harvest to find out more.
The stereotypical image of the Pacific Northwest is wet. Think rainforests, glaciers, and the rainy reputations of cities like Seattle, Vancouver, and Portland. But head east, and the climate changes dramatically. The spine of mountains wrings moisture out of the atmosphere, creating a vast expanse of dry, sunny land on the lee side of the Cascade Range, with just enough rainfall and irrigation to grow over 80 varieties of wine grapes. In Washington state alone, the result is nearly 25,000 hectares of vineyards, more wine grape cultivation than in countries like Czechia, Croatia, or Slovenia. The heart of Washington winemaking, meanwhile, is the remote agricultural town of Walla Walla. I met up with one of the state's leading wine educators to find out more about what makes Washington wine tick.
I'm Kaylee Brooke. I'm an advanced sommelier. I also have my WSET diploma, and I am one of the educators for the Wine Alliance here in Walla Walla. When you think about American wine and U.S. wine, I think most consumers, the reference point is Napa and Sonoma, right? When you go, you expect to taste Cabernet and Chardonnay and Pinot Noir and Merlot and just a really small handful of things that they do well and are really known for. And a lot of the people, the pioneers who helped start Napa also came up and provided expertise for Walla Walla in the very beginning of its AVA status. But the majority of people who started here in Washington were just farmers. They had apples and hops and onions and things like that. And a few really handy people thought, well, let's grow grapes, let's try it. but they were all farmers to start with. And so it's really sort of come from a farming mentality and a sort of get it done, figure it out mentality. And obviously there were some hiccups along the way. If you talk to some of the originals, Gary Figgins from Leonetti, who was, Leonetti was the first bonded winery in Washington. You ask him about his early vintages and he was like, we were just making it work. We had no idea what we were doing. And some of his early vintages are my favorite. So you have this really great farmer mentality and a lot of expertise coming in from California. So we also grow Cabernet, Chardonnay, Merlot. We do those things well. Riesling, unusually, but we're not locked or pigeonholed into a certain style or a certain set of grapes. Our climate allows us to do a whole variety of things. And so you'll have Cabernet and Riesling in the same vineyard. And you'll have Rhone varietals, and I've got a friend who's doing Greek varietals. He's doing Sirtigo, and he's doing Fiano from Italy, and all kinds of really fun stuff. So we do Cabernet, but we also have this amazing variety of grapes that we're growing and making wine from, which I think makes us unique in the U.S. for sure.
You're describing a winemaking style that is unencumbered by tradition, which is very much in contrast to some of the world's more traditional winemaking regions, especially in Europe. How does Walla Walla fit into the old world, new world wine dynamic?
Well, I think we like to say that we are the new world of the old world wine, right? And so we're not Napa, we're not Sonoma, and we're certainly not Europe, but we fit in this really sort of nice space right in between, where we can make fruit-forward big styles of Cabernet with a bit of oak like you might find in Napa. And we can also make really sort of elegant, restrained, pulled back, earth-driven wines that you would find in Europe.
My visit to Walla Walla coincided with the hectic harvest season. Trucks loaded with grapes rumbled along two-lane roads early in the morning, heading for processing facilities, where winemakers worked overtime to get fresh fruit bottled for fermentation. The head winemaker at one of the region's newest wineries, which is making waves for its admirable regenerative agricultural practices, took some time out from an early morning harvest to share more about this most cherished time of year.
I'm Brian Rudine. I'm the general manager and the winemaker at Echolands Winery. First off, we're a winery in the Walla Walla Valley, and we source from our estate vineyards here in the valley. The idea here is to make fresh, bright, slightly early picked but energetic wines that can age well. And behind that is a philosophy that we need to do right by our environment, by the people who work with this and touch it. Really, it's about sustainability, and it's guided every other decision we've ever made as we've built this brand new winery and gotten into our vineyard development here in Walla Walla. What's more important is probably how we plant. It's giving time for the ground to rest between its last crop, which in our case was mostly wheat and peas out here, which is what has been traditionally grown in the area for over 100 years. But giving time for the ground to rest, the soil to recover, to invite fungal and mycorrhizal and bacterial activity, earthworms back to the soil, and recover from commercial agricultural farming. And because thankfully viticulture can be very low input. You can grow grapes with very little fertilizer, with very little input to the ground. You have to control your weeds, of course, and so we seek animals and hand cultivation in order to get weeds out of the ground rather than spraying with herbicides. It's gearing everything that we do to use the resources on our farmland. Out here we have 340 acres, but the farm should nourish the rest of the farm. So the idea is, rather than bringing fertilizer from off-site and compost from off-site, using what we have with our plants, the crops that we choose to grow outside of grapes, and our animals in order to have the farm nourish the farm. Harvest is definitely the best time of year when you make wine. We only pick grapes really in September and October up here in Washington State, and we're not in control of our own schedule. The grapes are ripening every day with all the sunshine they receive. Rain and frost events and weather pushes us outside of the pocket, so we have to frequently scramble before we're ready to go. And so what happens is there's an energy in the air, which is we work as hard as we have to work until it's done. We've been preparing all year for it. It really does take 8 months to get everything in place for the craziness of harvest. And so when you get here, it's really fun. It's physical work, it's dirty work, it's really fun work.
From Echolands, I traveled a few miles down the road to somewhere with a more languid pace. Wine aficionados come from around the world to Walla Walla, and the best appointed digs are likely here at Abeja Inn and Winery, a lovingly restored farmstead with estate vineyards and a highly regarded restaurant. James Beard-nominated chef and restaurateur Michael Easton left the Seattle culinary scene 2 years ago and relocated to Walla Walla. He now runs the kitchen at Abeja. After breakfast, I sat down with Chef Easton to learn more about the appeal of cooking so close to the vine.
One project that we just completed in the kitchen, just as a test, is one of my favorite ingredients from Tuscany, an ingredient called saba. Saba is a grape must reduction. The finished product is a very dark, thick syrup that has sort of the mouthfeel and flavors of a really aged balsamic, but without the acidic vinegar edge. So it's more of like a sweet side of a grape reduction, just a very intense grape flavor. And I've never had the opportunity to make it because I've never had the opportunity to go and just pull 15 pounds of grape must straight out of the extractor, put it in a pot, and start it simmering. It's about a 4-day process of boiling down this grape must and then finally reducing it into a thick black syrup that just tastes like the essence of grapes and vines and the terroir, and it's beautiful on yogurts and ice creams and all sorts of things. And we got to make it for the very first time here at Abeja. We have our own estate saba that we were able to produce, and that's something you just couldn't do in the city without quite a bit of trouble.
For Monocle, in Walla Walla, Washington, I'm Gregory Scruggs.
Thank you, Gregory. This is The Menu. Now it's time for the week's top food and drink headlines. Here is Monocle's Maisie Ringer.
The Swiss government has decided that local wine growers won't have to follow the new EU labelling rules if their bottles are staying within Switzerland. European regulations now require wine bottles to list ingredients and nutritional information, a step deemed unnecessary since the majority of Swiss wine is sold domestically. Wine that is to be sold in the EU will have to comply with the new requirements, a move which those in the wine industry say will ramp up costs. Despite centuries of French tradition in making the delicacy, it was Japan that stole the show at the World Pâté en Croûte Championship in Lyon. Teiki Mano's gold leaf creation of duck, foie gras and pork claimed first prize. With 4 of the past 5 championships resulting in Japanese victory, French newspaper Le Parisien has conceded that Japan should be viewed as the land of pâté en croûte at least as much as France. The Japanese rice wine sake has been added to UNESCO's safeguarded list of cultural practices and products deserving of recognition. Sake is considered a divine gift in Japan and has been a staple for social and cultural events since the 8th century. Japanese breweries hope that the new listing could lift the country's export economy. Other items on UNESCO's list included Brazilian white cheese and Palestinian olive oil soap.
Thanks, Maisie. You're listening to The Menu. And finally, we've just passed the end of November and are heading quickly into the festive season. So we're joined by Monocle's sub-editor and in-house wine expert Chloé Lake for her pick of Wine of the Month. This week, we're staying in the UK for something suitably sparkling ahead of the holidays. We're trying Swanaford's Classic Cuvée 2018. Chloé, I'm very glad to see what I'm seeing because I have to say, there was part of me that was a bit worried that doing sparkling for festive season would be a little bit like florals for spring. But then again, what do you want to drink when the holidays come around? It's just sparkling wine. So let's be honest to ourselves and let's indulge our basest instincts.
Yep.
And pop the cork on this one.
Exactly. You know, there's no better time to have sparkling wine than Christmas and New Year's. So it had to be done. And we're going to England this time, so close to home, with a beautiful English sparkling wine from Devon. So very exciting.
So I think this is really interesting because I feel like in the past few years, a few sparkling wine producers from the UK have started becoming a bit more mainstream. But it turns out this is something with a bit more of a tradition that perhaps we expected. It's not quite so up and coming as we thought it would.
Absolutely. You're very right. I mean, there's a lot of well-known producers now. You can think of Nye, Timber, Rathfinney, Chapel Down. But English sparkling actually goes back as far as the kind of 1700s. And some people say it was even around before champagne. So a controversial, very controversial claim. But it's actually in 1662. There was an English physician called Christopher Merritt, and he first documented the addition of sugar in sparkling wine in a paper on fermentation. And then 4 years later, a guy called John Rose wrote a book called The English Vineyard Vindicated. Great title, great title.
Always very unconfrontational in this type of endeavor.
Yeah, exactly. And I have a few fun extracts from the book. So he talks about kind of the English climate and the soil. And he says, natural, sweet, and benign showers influences impart both life and pregnancy to these noble plantations.
Wow.
Which is an incredible quote. And then on the kind of chalky soil that we have here in the UK, which is very similar to Champagne, he says, in such hard, stony, or chalky ground, vines do exceedingly flourish, especially if the land have lain a good while in repose. So this is in the 1700s. We have someone who is kind of pioneering wine. So yeah, it does date back quite a far way, really. It's not just in the 21st century that English sparkling is becoming a thing.
So obviously they were quite proud of the product they were making, but let's be honest, Champagne, Prosecco, Franciacorta, they're much more, I suppose, well-known to international audiences than English sparkling wine would be.
Absolutely. So, I mean, back in the 17th century, they weren't really growing vineyards. They were kind of researching, but it was only in the 20th, 21st century that people really started to plant. And in the 80s, it was a couple called David and Linda Taylor, and they were the first to produce sparkling wine in East Sussex. And since then, we've seen the rise of Nye Timber, in particularly, who I think it was 1997, they beat Champagne to the Gold Award with the IWSC. I mean, it was a blind tasting. Everyone thought it was Champagne, and then it was kind of, bam, English sparkling was on the market. And since then, really, it's kind of had an unprecedented rise in popularity. So
you mentioned Nye Timber as one of the most well-known labels. But what do we have here? Because I have not heard of this winery before.
Yeah, it's called Swaniford. I had it last year on New Year's, and it was really, really great. Kind of, tastes like a classic champagne, really. It's a small family-run vineyard set up by a husband and wife duo who moved to London with the ambition of making great English sparkling. And I think it's a pretty great cuvée. And yeah, I'm excited to taste it with you.
Well, you need not say more.
I know.
I see it in front of us.
Let's pop it open.
Let's do it. Yeah,
sounds really nice.
Quite foamy, right?
Yeah. Fine mousse, as they say.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I think that's plenty.
Cool.
Shall we?
Yep.
Wow, this is delicious.
Yeah, really nice, right?
Really crisp.
Very crisp, very fine, nice and dry, like what you would expect from a champagne as well. And as I say, that's because England kind of has this nice, cool, temperate climate to grow the grapes now. So you're getting really nice acidity and, it's just, delicious.
I'm going to put myself out there, even though I am a total imposter at this. But I can feel a bit of apple in here. Am I crazy?
No, I would say so. It's a little bit fruity, actually. It's not completely dry as maybe you'd expect from a champagne. It does have a little bit of that kind of, fruit-forward taste. Yeah, really nice.
So how would you recommend people enjoy their champagne come the festive season?
Ooh,
are you the kind
question.
of person who will always have it with food? What kind of temperature? There is a ritual to it. And what's your recommendation?
I think temperature-wise, it's got to be pretty cold for me. It just helps kind of with that nice acidity and adds to that flavor. In terms of food, do what you want, I say. You can have it without food, you can have it with. A lot of people are having fried chicken with champagne and sparkling wine now. And I mean, that's really kicking off.
How do you feel about that?
I've never tried it, but I would be for it. I think it sounds it sounds interesting.
Cuts through the richness
exactly.
is how they would say it.
Fried chicken's so greasy and this is so acidic, so maybe it would work. I'm not sure, but yeah, cheese would be great as well. That's fatty, so it would work quite well with that acidity, as I say. Yeah, probably more of kind of like a starter canapé situation, but I think, champagne and sparkling is best enjoyed whenever you want it.
Well, wonderful.
Yeah.
Cheers to that. Have a wonderful
Cheers.
holiday break. And thank you for at least parting with one of your bottles ahead of the festive season.
I've got a stockpile.
Thank you so much, Chloe.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chloe. And that's all for this edition of The Menu. Remember that we are back with a new episode again on Friday at 2000 London time. That's a midday in San Francisco. Also, don't forget to tune into our spin-off show, Food Neighborhoods, for a tour of some of the world's tastiest destinations. I am Chiara Rimella. This programme was produced by Monica Lillis and our sound engineer was Flynn Simons. Thanks for listening, and until next week.